My name is Nora. I am 25 years old and I scrub the dirty floors of wealthy strangers just to feed my 3-year-old daughter. On a freezing night in late November, I packed a single canvas bag while the angry man who claimed to love me was passed out on the living room sofa. He had punched a massive hole in the thin drywall right next to my head exactly 2 hours earlier. I did not wait for the sun to come up. I simply scooped my sleeping toddler into my tired arms and walked directly out into the cold rain. What I endured over the next several months is a brutal story of total survival and absolute betrayal. Welcome to Drama Storytime, where we sit quietly with the dark secrets families never talk about out loud. Please leave a comment and be sure to subscribe to the channel. I met the angry man when I was only 20 years old. He was charming and promised to take care of me forever. I was young and looking for a safe place to hide from my chaotic childhood. My own mother has severe mental health issues and spent my youth bouncing between terrible boyfriends. I desperately wanted a stable home. The charming man offered me a beautiful house. He slowly convinced me to quit my retail job and stop talking to my friends. The isolation happened so slowly that I absolutely did not notice the heavy cage closing around me until the lock clicked shut. The emotional abuse started shortly after our sweet daughter was born. He completely controlled every single dollar that came into the house. I had to beg him for grocery money and show the exact paper receipts every time. He used his physical size to intimidate me and threw heavy glass plates at the kitchen wall. The people in our small town thought he was a wonderful father. They absolutely did not see the terrifying monster who paced the dark hallways. They did not hear the cruel insults he whispered while our young daughter was sleeping. The night I finally escaped was a completely normal Tuesday evening. The angry man came home from his construction job smelling strongly of cheap beer. He demanded a hot dinner the exact second he walked through the heavy front door. I accidentally dropped a small metal spoon onto the floor. The loud noise caused him to completely snap. He threw his dinner plate across the kitchen and backed me into the tight corner near the refrigerator. He raised his heavy fist and slammed it directly into the drywall, just a few inches from my right ear. My young daughter started crying hysterically. The angry man looked at me with cold eyes and told me I was completely worthless. Then he walked to the sofa and fell asleep within 20 minutes. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen for exactly 1 hour. I stared at the massive hole in the white drywall and realized my head was next on his list. I quietly walked into the dark bedroom and pulled a canvas bag from the closet. I packed exactly 3 changes of clothes for my daughter and 1 warm sweater for myself. I grabbed the small envelope of emergency cash I had been secretly hiding under the sink. The envelope contained exactly $340. I carefully zipped the heavy bag and walked into the living room. I gently picked up my sleeping toddler and wrapped her in a thick blanket. The angry man snored loudly right next to the front door. I held my breath and turned the metal deadbolt. I stepped out into the freezing winter rain and started walking down the dark street without looking back. The freezing rain soaked through my thin jacket within 10 minutes. I walked exactly 3 miles to a local gas station that stayed open all night. I sat inside the brightly lit store and bought a warm cup of coffee. The tired cashier looked at me with deep pity, but he absolutely did not ask any difficult questions. I waited in that plastic booth until the sun finally started to rise. I used a payphone to call a local domestic violence shelter. The kind woman told me their facility was full, but she offered a voucher for a cheap motel located 2 towns away. I thanked her and used $20 to hire a local taxi. Sitting in the back of that taxi cab, I realized my entire life was starting over from absolutely nothing. I promised my sleeping daughter I would build a brand new life even if I had to scrub every single dirty floor in the city. The taxi dropped us off in front of a decaying building painted a terrible shade of yellow. The cheap motel smelled heavily of stale smoke and strong industrial bleach. I carried my sleeping daughter and my single canvas bag into the small room. The worn carpet was sticky and the television set was completely broken. I locked the thin wooden door and slid a heavy wooden chair right under the metal handle. The exhausted toddler woke up and asked where we were. I forced a bright smile onto my tired face and told her we were on a special camping trip. She accepted the simple lie and started playing with a plastic cup on the bed. I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable mattress and counted my remaining cash. I had exactly $300 left after paying for the expensive taxi. That tiny amount of money stood between us and the cold winter streets. I knew I needed to secure a job before the sun went down. The motel voucher would only cover exactly 3 nights of basic shelter. I walked to the small motel office and asked the tired manager if I could borrow the local newspaper. I scoured the printed classified pages, looking for anything that paid daily cash. A small advertisement caught my eye. A local residential cleaning service was desperately hiring maids. The advertisement explicitly stated that absolutely no prior experience was required. I used the motel telephone to call the printed number. A harsh woman answered the line and told me to come to the corporate office at noon for a quick interview. I thanked her and carefully hung up the heavy plastic receiver. The next massive hurdle was finding temporary childcare for my 3-year-old daughter. I absolutely could not take a toddler to clean houses. I realized I had to call the one person I desperately wanted to avoid. I dialed the phone number belonging to my own mother. She answered the phone sounding completely scattered and highly energetic. I explained that I had left the angry man and desperately needed her to watch my daughter for just a few hours. My mother immediately started making wild excuses about her complex art projects. I pleaded with her and explained we were completely homeless. She finally agreed to meet me at a local park. I packed our canvas bag and took another taxi to the meeting spot. My mother arrived 30 minutes late, driving a rusted car. She looked deeply annoyed, but she took the young girl. I felt a terrible knot in my stomach, leaving my sweet child with such an unreliable woman, but I simply had no other choice. I walked exactly 2 miles to the cleaning service office. The small building was located in a depressing industrial park. The harsh woman sitting behind the metal desk barely looked up when I walked inside. She handed me a thick stack of employment forms and told me the pay was exactly $9 an hour. She stated I had to provide my own transportation and buy my own cleaning supplies from their company store. I signed the heavy paperwork with a shaking hand. I used my precious remaining cash to purchase the required plastic bucket and the strong chemical sprays. Buying the mandatory supplies drained exactly $60 from my tiny emergency fund. I was left with just $240 in my deep pocket. The harsh manager handed me a printed paper containing my very first cleaning assignment. I walked out of the corporate office holding my heavy plastic bucket. I had successfully secured a paying job, but I was still completely terrified. The winter wind whipped across my tired face as I waited at the rusted bus stop. I thought about the angry man and wondered if he had finally woken up to find the empty closet. I knew he would start hunting for me the exact second he realized his control was broken. I gripped the handle of my plastic bucket and promised myself I would scrub every single floor in this entire city to keep my daughter perfectly safe. The long bus ride to my very first cleaning assignment took almost 2 hours. I sat near the back window and watched the wealthy suburbs slowly appear. Massive houses with perfectly manicured lawns replaced the dirty industrial buildings. I clutched my heavy plastic bucket and reviewed the printed paper. The wealthy client was an older woman who lived in a massive mansion near the ocean. I finally stepped off the public bus and walked up the long paved driveway. The front door was incredibly tall and made of heavy dark wood. I took a deep breath and pressed the small brass doorbell. A woman wearing an expensive silk robe opened the heavy door. She looked me up and down with an expression of deep judgment. She did not ask for my name or offer a single polite greeting. She simply pointed toward the massive kitchen and told me the floors needed extreme scrubbing. She also demanded I clean all 4 luxury bathrooms before 3 in the afternoon. I nodded my head and walked into the grand kitchen. The sheer size of the beautiful house was entirely overwhelming. The kitchen alone was larger than the entire apartment I used to share with the angry man. I tied my hair back and put on my cheap rubber gloves. I filled the plastic bucket with warm water and strong chemical soap. I dropped to my knees and started scrubbing the expensive stone tiles. The physical labor was incredibly brutal. My lower back started to ache within the very first hour. My knees throbbed against the hard stone floor. I scrubbed dried food and spilled wine off the custom wooden cabinets. I moved to the luxury bathrooms and scrubbed massive glass showers until my arms felt like heavy lead. The wealthy woman completely ignored me the entire time. She simply sat on her velvet sofa and talked loudly on her mobile phone about an upcoming vacation to Europe. I listened to her complain about the minor inconveniences of luxury travel while I scrubbed dirt out of her toilet. The massive contrast between our 2 lives was deeply nauseating. She was angry about a delayed flight, while I was completely terrified about feeding my toddler tomorrow morning. I pushed the dark thoughts away and focused entirely on the dirty floors. I knew every single hour I worked meant another small meal for my sweet daughter. I finally finished the exhausting assignment at exactly 3 in the afternoon. My entire body was covered in cold sweat and cheap chemical soap. The wealthy woman handed me a piece of paper confirming the completed hours. She did not offer me a glass of water or a single word of genuine thanks. I walked back down the long paved driveway, carrying my wet supplies. I rode the public bus back to the dirty industrial park to hand the paperwork to the harsh manager. The manager calculated my total wages for the grueling day. She subtracted a mandatory fee for the bus pass and another fee for the cleaning uniform. She handed me exactly $36 in cash. I stared at the tiny pile of crumpled bills in total absolute shock. I had just broken my physical body for several hours, and the meager reward was barely enough to buy cheap groceries. I put the thin bills into my deep pocket and rushed to the local park to meet my erratic mother. The afternoon sun was already starting to set, and the winter air was growing incredibly cold. I found my mother sitting on a wooden bench looking highly distracted. My sweet daughter was playing in the dirty sandbox, wearing only a thin sweater. She looked completely freezing, and her small hands were covered in cold mud. I ran forward and scooped the freezing toddler into my tired arms. I asked my mother why she did not put the warm winter coat on the young child. The older woman simply rolled her eyes and claimed she completely forgot about the heavy coat. She loudly complained that watching a toddler was severely ruining her creative energy. I realized in that exact moment that my own mother would never be a reliable safe harbor. I thanked her coldly and walked away carrying my freezing daughter. We went to a cheap discount store and bought a loaf of bread and a small jar of peanut butter. We walked back to the depressing motel room as the dark night completely swallowed the rusted town. I locked the thin wooden door and fed my daughter the simple meal. She ate the soft bread and fell asleep on the uncomfortable mattress. I sat on the cold floor and counted my tiny pile of cash. The brutal reality of extreme poverty was finally setting in, but I was still deeply thankful to be far away from the angry man. The 3 short nights at the cheap motel completely vanished. I woke up on the 4th morning, knowing we had absolutely nowhere to sleep that coming night. The motel manager knocked loudly on the thin wooden door at exactly 10 in the morning. He told me I had to vacate the small room immediately unless I could pay $50 in cash. I looked at the tiny pile of money resting on the cheap nightstand. Paying for another night would leave us completely starving. I packed our single canvas bag and dressed my sweet daughter in her thick winter sweater. We walked out of the yellow building and headed toward the local government assistance office. The government building was a massive concrete structure filled with completely exhausted people. We waited in a long line that stretched down the cold hallway. I held the hand of my toddler and tried to keep her quiet with a small piece of cheap bread. We finally reached the front desk after waiting for exactly 4 hours. The tired social worker handed me a massive stack of complicated paperwork. She explained that the waiting list for subsidized housing was currently 7 months long. I desperately asked her about emergency shelters for domestic violence survivors. She sighed heavily and told me the local shelters were entirely full because of the freezing winter weather. She handed me a printed list of cheap apartments that sometimes accepted cash payments without formal credit checks. I thanked her and walked back out into the freezing wind. I spent the entire afternoon walking from one decaying apartment building to another. Every single landlord demanded a massive security deposit I simply did not possess. I realized we were going to spend the cold night sleeping on the hard plastic benches at the central bus station. The heavy weight of complete failure pressed down on my tired shoulders. I had taken my sweet daughter away from a warm house only to make her completely homeless. I sat on a wooden bench at a local park to feed my toddler the rest of the peanut butter. A dark blue sedan suddenly pulled up to the curb just 50 feet away. My blood ran completely cold. It was the exact car belonging to the angry man. I grabbed my daughter and pulled her behind a large oak tree. I peered around the rough bark and watched him step out of the heavy vehicle. He looked incredibly angry and highly erratic. He walked over to the exact same wooden bench where my mother had sat just 3 days ago. He had obviously manipulated my scattered mother into revealing the general area where she met me. I held my breath and prayed my young daughter would stay completely silent. The angry man paced back and forth across the frozen grass. He shouted cruel threats into the cold winter air. He loudly promised he would completely destroy my life the exact second he found me. The terrifying monster was hunting us like small prey in the open city. A group of older teenagers suddenly walked down the paved path. The angry man stopped shouting and quickly got back into his dark blue vehicle. He sped away, leaving a thick cloud of gray exhaust in the cold air. My legs were shaking so violently I could barely stand up. I knew the open streets were absolutely no longer safe. I carried my toddler directly to the central bus station. I found a dark corner near the broken vending machines. I wrapped the young girl in my heavy winter coat and held her tightly against my chest. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly above our heads. I stayed completely awake the entire night, watching every single person who walked through the heavy glass doors. The constant fear kept my eyes completely wide open. I knew the dangerous man was actively circling the dark city looking for us. I also knew I had to report to the cleaning service corporate office the very next morning to get another daily assignment. If I did not work, we would completely starve. I had to somehow hide my toddler during the day while I scrubbed dirty floors. The impossible situation felt like a massive, crushing weight. I kissed the warm forehead of my sleeping daughter and promised her the morning sun would eventually bring a better solution. The long night dragged on while the freezing wind howled against the thin glass windows of the lonely bus station. The harsh morning light finally broke through the dirty glass windows of the central bus station. I woke up with a terrible pain in my neck from sleeping on the hard plastic bench. My sweet daughter was still completely asleep, wrapped tightly in my heavy winter coat. I gently woke her up and promised her a nice warm breakfast. We walked to a small bakery down the street and I spent $3 on a plain muffin and a small carton of milk. I watched her eat the soft food and desperately tried to formulate a safe plan for the day. I absolutely could not leave her with my erratic mother ever again. I remembered a small community church we passed the previous afternoon. The wooden sign outside the church mentioned a daily childcare program for low-income families. I carried my toddler and our heavy canvas bag exactly 2 miles to the old brick church. The winter wind was incredibly cruel, but we finally reached the heavy wooden doors. A kind older woman wearing a thick knitted sweater greeted us in the warm hallway. I swallowed my heavy pride and explained our desperate situation. I told her I was fleeing a highly dangerous man and needed to work a cleaning job just to survive. The kind woman looked at the tired toddler and completely understood the unspoken terror in my voice. She gently took my daughter by the hand and told me the daily fee was completely waived. A massive wave of pure relief washed over my exhausted body. I thanked the older woman profusely and rushed to the public bus stop. I arrived at the cleaning service office exactly 5 minutes late. The harsh manager scowled at me and handed me a brand new printed assignment. She warned me that the specific house was incredibly dirty and required extreme chemical scrubbing. I took the printed paper and rode another public bus to a decaying neighborhood on the opposite side of the city. The assigned house looked completely abandoned from the outside. The front yard was entirely overgrown with dead winter weeds. I unlocked the front door using the hidden key box and stepped inside the dark hallway. The terrible smell of rotting garbage and stale cigarette smoke immediately hit my face. The entire house was an absolute nightmare of massive hoarding and deep neglect. Thick piles of old newspapers and empty glass bottles covered every single floor. The small kitchen was completely coated in a thick layer of dark grease and mold. I put on my cheap rubber gloves and tied a torn rag around my nose and mouth. I filled my heavy plastic bucket with the strongest chemical bleach I possessed. I spent the next 6 hours doing the most disgusting physical labor of my entire life. I shoveled rotting food into heavy black garbage bags. I scrubbed the dark black mold off the shower walls until my arms violently shook. My lungs burned from the toxic bleach fumes trapped inside the small bathroom. I completely finished the massive job right around 4 in the afternoon. My entire body felt deeply bruised and completely broken. I locked the front door and rode the bus back to the corporate office. The harsh manager handed me exactly $42 for the grueling day of toxic labor. I walked out of the office and headed straight back to the brick church. My sweet daughter was happily painting a colorful picture when I arrived. The kind older woman pulled me aside and handed me a small piece of folded paper. She whispered that she called a private domestic violence shelter on the edge of the city. She told me a single bed had miraculously opened up just an hour ago. She gave me the secret address and told me to go there immediately. The dark storm was finally starting to show a tiny break in the heavy clouds. I held the small piece of paper tightly in my tired hand and silently cried tears of absolute gratitude. I held the small piece of folded paper tightly in my tired hand. The secret address written on the page was located far away on the extreme outer edge of the cold city. I carried my heavy canvas bag and held the hand of my sweet daughter as we walked to the central bus terminal. We rode 3 different public buses to reach the designated neighborhood. The area was incredibly quiet and completely hidden behind tall evergreen trees. We finally stood in front of a completely normal-looking brick house. There was absolutely no signs or identifying markers on the outside. The building was designed to blend perfectly into the quiet residential street. I walked up the concrete steps and pushed the small brass doorbell, and a heavy security camera mounted above the door shifted to look directly at my face. A stern voice echoed from a small metal speaker, asking for my given name and the specific name of the person who sent me. I spoke my name and mentioned the kind older woman from the brick church. A heavy magnetic lock clicked loudly, and the thick metal door slowly swung open. A security guard wearing plain clothes quickly ushered us inside and locked the door behind us. The interior of the building looked exactly like a standard community center. A caseworker met us in the bright hallway. She handed me a thick packet of strict house rules. She explained that the location of the shelter must remain an absolute secret. I was completely forbidden from telling absolutely anyone where we were sleeping. She stated that my cellular phone had to be completely turned off and surrendered to the front desk to prevent any digital tracking by the angry man. I gladly handed over the dead plastic device. Giving up the telephone felt like severing the very last heavy chain connecting me to my dark past. The caseworker led us down a long hallway lined with identical wooden doors. She unlocked a door near the very end of the hall and handed me a real brass key. We stepped inside the tiny room. The space contained a single twin bed and a small wooden crib and a highly scratched dresser. The room was incredibly basic, but it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen in my entire life. It was warm and completely clean, and most importantly, it was entirely secure behind heavy steel doors. I set my heavy canvas bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the twin mattress. My sweet daughter immediately climbed onto the soft bed and curled into a tight ball. She fell asleep within exactly 2 minutes. I sat alone in the quiet room and listened to the soft breathing of my toddler. The sudden massive drop in pure adrenaline hit my tired body like a physical blow. I had spent the last 5 days running on pure, absolute terror. Now that the immediate physical danger was finally locked outside, my mind started playing terrible tricks on me. I kept hearing the loud voice of the angry man echoing in the dark corners of the tiny room. Every single time a door closed loudly down the long hallway, I violently flinched and braced for a heavy impact. The physical escape was finally complete, but the deep psychological war was only just beginning. I woke up the very next morning feeling incredibly sore from the toxic house I scrubbed the previous day. My lungs still burned slightly from the harsh chemical bleach, but I knew I absolutely had to go back to the cleaning service office. The safe shelter provided basic food and a warm bed, but I still needed actual cash to eventually build a real, independent life. I dressed my sweet daughter and brought her to the daycare room located on the first floor of the secure shelter. The young girl was hesitant to leave my side, but a kind volunteer offered her a beautiful picture book. I kissed her warm forehead and promised I would return before dinner. I walked out of the heavy steel doors and faced the freezing morning air. I rode the long bus back to the industrial park and walked into the corporate office. The harsh manager handed me another printed paper. She told me I was assigned to clean a newly constructed house in the wealthy suburbs. The intense physical labor was slowly destroying my fragile body, but I completely refused to stop fighting. I gripped my heavy plastic bucket and headed back out into the cold city. I was absolutely no longer just running away from the dangerous monster. I was finally walking toward a brand new, beautiful future. The long bus ride to the wealthy suburbs gave my exhausted body a brief moment of quiet rest. I arrived at the newly constructed house right at 9 in the morning. The massive building was completely empty of furniture, but every single surface was covered in thick white construction dust. The fine powder floated in the cold air and coated my dark clothing the exact second I walked inside. Cleaning construction dust is an absolute nightmare. because water just turns the fine powder into a thick white mud. I had to carefully sweep every single wooden floor before I could even begin to use my heavy plastic bucket and strong chemical soap. I spent 4 straight hours kneeling on the hard wood, carefully wiping the custom baseboards with a dry cloth. My lungs ached deeply from breathing the heavy dust, and my empty stomach growled loudly in the quiet house. I ate a cheap granola bar while sitting on the grand staircase. I looked at the beautiful empty rooms and imagined what it would feel like to actually raise my sweet daughter in a completely safe home. The massive distance between my current reality and that beautiful dream felt impossible to cross, but I refused to stop trying. I finished scrubbing the massive glass windows just as the winter sun began to lower in the cold gray sky. I locked the heavy front door and took the public bus back to the dirty industrial park. The harsh manager sitting behind the metal desk inspected my completed paperwork. She handed me exactly $45 for 8 hours of incredibly brutal labor. I looked at the small pile of crumpled bills and felt a sudden spark of pure anger. I realized the wealthy clients were paying the corporate agency hundreds of dollars for my specific labor, while I received absolutely pennies. The greedy company was simply exploiting my desperate situation to maximize their own corporate profits. I walked out of the corporate office and stood near the rusted bus stop waiting for the evening transit. A sudden realization hit my tired brain with incredible force. I already knew exactly how to perform the difficult physical work. I simply needed to completely cut out the greedy middleman taking all the money. I decided right then that I would start my own independent cleaning business. I would slowly build a private list of wealthy clients and keep every single dollar I rightfully earned. I would design my own schedule and absolutely never answer to the harsh manager ever again. The spark of pure anger completely transformed into a bright flame of determined ambition. I rode the evening bus back to the secret domestic violence shelter. I walked through the heavy steel doors and found my sweet daughter waiting in the bright daycare room. She ran toward me and squeezed my legs with her tiny arms. I picked her up and carried her back to our tiny, quiet room. We ate a warm dinner provided by the kind shelter volunteers in the communal dining hall. The food was incredibly simple, but it filled our empty stomachs with much-needed warmth. I sat at a large plastic table across from a young woman who was also hiding from a dangerous monster. She spoke with a very soft voice and told me a terrifying truth I'd absolutely not considered yet. She warned me that the angry man could easily file formal court documents, claiming I illegally kidnapped our young child from her primary home. He could use the complicated family legal system to aggressively force me to return his daughter to the toxic house. My blood ran completely cold as I listened to her dark warning. I realized hiding behind heavy steel doors was absolutely not a permanent solution to my massive problem. I needed to build a solid legal defense before he could strike the first heavy blow against my fragile life. I needed to formally file for full legal custody and establish primary residency. The heavy weight of the complex legal battle landed squarely on my tired shoulders. I carried my sleeping daughter back to our quiet room and tucked her into the small crib under a warm blanket. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and grabbed a small paper notebook. I wrote down my brand new goals using a cheap plastic pen. I would build my own independent cleaning business to secure real money. I would find a way to hire a ruthless family lawyer to protect my child. I was absolutely done running away from him in the dark. I was finally preparing to stand my ground and fight for our bright future. The very next morning, I woke up long before the sun completely cleared the horizon. I walked to the small community library located just 3 blocks away from the secret shelter. I used exactly $4 from my tiny emergency fund to print 50 simple black and white flyers on the public copy machine. The cheap paper flyers advertised a brand new independent residential cleaning service. I explicitly wrote that I offered meticulous deep cleaning for a very fair cash price without any corporate overhead fees. I spent the entire freezing morning walking through a wealthy suburban neighborhood far away from the dark industrial park. I carefully placed the folded paper flyers under the windshield wipers of expensive luxury cars and tucked them into fancy brass mailboxes. My hands were completely numb from the bitter winter cold, but my bright ambition kept me walking down the long paved streets. I rode the public bus back to the cleaning service office right at noon just to secure my daily corporate assignment. I absolutely could not afford to quit the terrible agency until my private business actually secured a few paying clients. The harsh manager handed me a printed paper directing me to a large modern apartment building downtown. I spent the next 5 hours aggressively scrubbing polished concrete floors and wiping down stainless steel kitchen appliances. I finished the grueling work and collected my meager $40 from the greedy manager. The physical exhaustion was incredibly heavy, but I knew this terrible routine was finally coming to a permanent end very soon. 2 days passed without a single telephone call regarding my printed flyers. I started to feel a heavy wave of dark doubt creeping into my tired mind. I wondered if the wealthy homeowners completely ignored the cheap paper advertisements. Then, on the late afternoon of the third day, the communal telephone at the front desk of the secret shelter suddenly rang. The shelter volunteer smiled and handed the heavy plastic receiver directly to me. A soft voice on the other end of the line belonged to an older woman living in the exact neighborhood where I distributed my cheap flyers. She told me she desperately needed her massive house cleaned before a large family gathering that coming weekend. She offered to pay me exactly $20 an hour in pure cash. That specific amount was more than double what the greedy corporate agency paid me for my backbreaking labor. I accepted the private job with absolute massive gratitude. I told her I would arrive at her beautiful house bright and early on Saturday morning. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver and silently cheered in the quiet hallway. The brilliant spark of my independent business had finally caught fire. I knew if I did an absolutely perfect job for this single woman, she would definitely recommend my specific services to all her wealthy friends. I was finally building a solid financial ladder to climb completely out of the dark hole. The financial progress felt incredibly empowering, but the looming legal threat still hung over my tired head like a dark storm cloud. I knew the angry man was still aggressively hunting for us in the cold city. I took a morning off from the corporate agency and visited a local family law clinic located near the central courthouse. I sat in a crowded waiting room filled with terrified parents, holding thick stacks of legal documents. I finally met with a young lawyer who offered free pro bono legal services for domestic violence survivors. She listened very carefully as I explained my terrifying escape and the absolute necessity of securing full legal custody of my sweet daughter. The young lawyer nodded her head and handed me a thick packet of formal court petitions. She explained that we needed to immediately file an emergency custody order to prevent the angry man from legally snatching the young girl off the public street. She warned me that the legal process would formally notify him of the court date, and we would eventually have to face him inside a quiet courtroom. The sudden thought of seeing his angry face again made my stomach completely twist into tight knots. But I looked at the young lawyer and firmly stated I was absolutely ready to fight him in the broad daylight. I signed the formal legal petitions with a very steady hand. The heavy gears of the family court system officially started turning that exact morning. I walked out of the legal clinic feeling like a completely different person. I was no longer just a terrified victim running blindly through the freezing rain. I was a fiercely protective mother building a strong fortress of legal paper and hard-earned cash. The crisp Saturday morning finally arrived with a bright winter sun. I left the secret shelter incredibly early to ensure I was completely punctual for my very first independent client. I rode the public bus across the city holding my heavy plastic bucket filled with my own chemical supplies. I walked up the long paved driveway of the massive house and rang the small brass doorbell. The older woman answered the heavy wooden door with a warm smile. She invited me inside and showed me the massive rooms. She needed meticulously scrubbed before her large family event. I put on my cheap rubber gloves and immediately went to work. I spent exactly 6 hours scrubbing every single wooden baseboard and polishing the massive glass windows until they were completely invisible. I organized her kitchen cabinets and made the stainless steel appliances shine like brand new silver. I wanted this specific house to look absolutely perfect. The older woman walked through the grand rooms right at 2 in the afternoon. She was completely amazed by the incredible level of deep cleanliness. She handed me exactly $120 in crisp cash. She also gave me a small paper list containing the names and telephone numbers of 3 wealthy friends who desperately needed reliable house cleaners. I walked out of that massive house feeling like I had just conquered the entire world. I took the public bus directly to the corporate cleaning agency. The harsh manager looked up from her metal desk with her usual angry scowl. I calmly set my cheap plastic bucket on the floor. I looked directly into her cold eyes and formally quit my terrible job. She started to yell terrible insults, but I simply turned around and walked out of the glass door. I was officially my own boss, and I kept every single dollar I physically earned. Over the next 3 weeks, my independent cleaning business grew incredibly fast. I worked exactly 6 days a week, cleaning beautiful houses in the wealthy suburbs. I opened a private bank account and slowly built a solid wall of financial security. I bought my sweet daughter brand new winter clothes and a beautiful stuffed bear. The crushing weight of extreme poverty slowly began to lift off my tired shoulders. But the bright joy of my financial independence was suddenly interrupted by a heavy legal reality. The young pro bono lawyer called the shelter telephone on a rainy Tuesday evening. She informed me that the local sheriff had officially served the emergency custody papers to the angry man. The formal court documents legally prevented him from coming anywhere near me or my young daughter. The papers also notified him of the mandatory preliminary hearing scheduled for the following Monday. The terrible monster finally knew exactly where and when he could see me. The dark anxiety completely flooded back into my tired chest. I spent the entire weekend preparing my mind for the brutal legal confrontation. I went to a local thrift store and purchased a modest gray suit for exactly $14. I wanted to look like a highly responsible and completely stable mother in front of the stern family court judge. The kind volunteers at the secret shelter promised to watch my sweet daughter for the entire day. They assured me she would be perfectly safe behind the heavy steel doors while I fought the massive legal war downtown. I barely slept a single hour on Sunday night. My mind endlessly replayed the terrifying moment he punched the white drywall right next to my head. The morning of the preliminary hearing was bitterly cold and covered in thick gray fog. I rode the public bus to the central courthouse downtown. The massive stone building looked incredibly intimidating. I walked through the strict metal detectors and took the heavy elevator to the fourth floor. The young lawyer was waiting for me outside the designated courtroom, holding a thick folder of legal evidence. She told me to remain completely calm no matter what the angry man tried to do. We slowly walked into the quiet courtroom and sat at the wooden petitioner table. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room suddenly swung open. My blood ran completely cold as the angry man walked down the center aisle. He wore a cheap, dark suit and stared directly at me with eyes full of pure venom. The final brutal battle for my absolute freedom was officially about to begin. The stern judge walked into the courtroom wearing a heavy black robe. We took our seats at the heavy wooden tables. The angry man sat just 15 feet away from me. He tried to stare at me to induce fear, but I kept my eyes locked on the wooden desk. The stern judge opened a thick legal file and asked the defense attorney to present his opening arguments. The lawyer representing the angry man stood up and began weaving a completely false narrative. He claimed I was a highly unstable woman who kidnapped a young child in the middle of the night for absolutely no logical reason. He stated that my secret residence at a domestic violence shelter was solid proof of my mental instability. He painted the angry man as a concerned father who simply wanted his family back in his safe home. The young pro bono lawyer sitting next to me remained perfectly calm. She stood up and addressed the stern judge with a powerful voice. She stated that I fled the house to protect my young daughter from escalating physical violence. She detailed the terrifying night the angry man punched a massive hole in the drywall just inches from my face. The young lawyer then presented a thick stack of financial documents to the court. She submitted my new independent business records and my growing bank account statements. She proved to the judge that I was a highly responsible mother, providing a safe environment for my child. She requested full legal custody and a permanent restraining order to keep the monster far away from us. The angry man hated hearing the absolute truth spoken aloud in a public room. He was completely used to controlling the narrative behind closed doors. The sheer reality of losing his total power caused his fake, calm demeanor to crack completely. He suddenly stood up and slammed his heavy fists onto the wooden table. He started screaming terrible insults at my young lawyer and called the stern judge a complete fool. 3 armed security guards immediately rushed forward and physically restrained the angry man. The stern judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel and threatened to hold the violent man in strict criminal contempt. The violent outburst was the absolute best piece of legal evidence my young lawyer could have presented. The stern judge looked down at the angry man with deep, absolute disgust. He stated that the violent temper tantrum clearly demonstrated exactly why the young child needed immediate legal protection. The judge ruled entirely in our favor. He granted me full legal custody and issued a permanent protective order. The legal document explicitly stated the angry man would go directly to a state prison if he ever came within 500 feet of my daughter or myself. The armed guards escorted the screaming monster out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors closed firmly behind him. Exactly 4 months passed after that dramatic day in the family court. My independent cleaning business became incredibly successful. I hired 2 brave women from the secret shelter to help me clean houses in the wealthy suburbs. I finally saved enough cash to rent a beautiful small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The bright rooms are painted a cheerful yellow, and absolutely no holes exist in the solid walls. My sweet daughter has her very own bedroom filled with soft toys and colorful storybooks. She laughs loudly every single day and completely forgot the dark shadow of the angry man. I am exactly 26 years old now. I still scrub floors, but I do it on my own specific terms. The plastic bucket is no longer a symbol of absolute desperation, and it is the tool I used to build a solid foundation of total freedom. Running away with a single canvas bag was the most terrifying decision of my life. But looking at my daughter sleeping safely in her own warm bed, I know the struggle was entirely worth it. Thank you for listening to Drama Storytime. Stay strong and build your own beautiful future. I will see you in the very next story.